Okay, we are going to go over more about using JavaScript to interactively change our web page. So far, the examples that we've gone over have looked like this, where we have a web page and we use JavaScript to change something about that page. If you remember the spoilers example, when we click on the buttons, the spoiler is either shown or hidden. We do this by changing some of the style attributes of the page. So if we look at the code, you'll notice we're calling a function called show spoiler2, for example. Show spoiler2, and we're taking that argument that gets passed in and we're changing the display property of the style. So notice how everything consists of the document get element by ID, which identifies the particular element of the page that we want to change. Then we're saying style because we want to change some aspect of the style. And that is anything that can be controlled by CSS. And display is an attribute of CSS. Therefore, we say style display. Likewise, color is an attribute that's contained in CSS. So we say style.color. Where we left off last time is we wrote a function to toggle the spoiler. That is, if the spoiler was shown, it would hide it. If the spoiler was hidden, it would show it. So in this case, the spoiler is not shown, it's hidden. So when we click toggle spoiler, we show it. When we click it again, we hide it. The way that works is when we click on this button, we call the function toggle spoiler, and we say what ID we want to toggle. And in this case, it's spoiler1, which is defined here in the HTML. What the toggle spoiler method or function does is it takes that ID, it finds it on the page, and if the display is none, or if there is no display element, in other words, the first time this page is loaded, there will not be a display element of that ID. So if it is none or there is no display element, and again, notice we're using .style display because display is an aspect of the style sheet. That means that it's hidden and we change it to being displayed. If, however, the style display property is something else, in other words, if it is blocked, we're going to change it back to none and we're going to hide it. Now, we've seen CSS in this example and in other examples where we're manipulating the CSS of the page. And we're manipulating the CSS of elements on the page that already exist. We can do that with HTML stuff too. For example, it would be cool if this button didn't say toggle spoiler, but when the spoiler was visible, if it said hide spoiler. And when the spoiler was invisible, it would say show spoiler. So I'm going to change it to show spoiler because initially when the page loads, the button is set to, or the button is visible, of course, but the element that we're trying to show or hide is invisible. So initially the spoiler is invisible. We click the show spoiler button to make it visible. So I'm going to give this an ID. And I'm going to call it toggle button 1. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually change this to change this text from show spoiler to hide spoiler. Now, how do we do that? Well, we're going to need to pass a second argument. We're going to call that button spoiler. And that button spoiler is going to be the ID of the button that we just clicked. So when we call it, we're going to say spoiler 1, comma, toggle button 1. And then we're going to change this to set the HTML between the start and ending tag of that button. And that property is known as the inner HTML property, and it's an aspect of the HTML. It's not an aspect of the style. Therefore, we do not say .style something. We say inner HTML. So if we are showing it, we want to change the button to say hide. Because if it's shown, we want to change it to text to say, put this button to hide the spoiler. And likewise, if it is hidden, we want to change it to say show spoiler. So initially, the toggle button says show spoiler. We click it and we show the spoiler, and the button's text changes to hide spoiler. We click it again to hide it. The button changes to show spoiler. The purpose of this example, and the reason I want to go over this, is to show you that we can not only change the CSS of the page, we can actually change the HTML. And there's a whole bunch of HTML properties. Inner HTML is just one of them. For example, if we wanted to change an image, we would change the src property. If we wanted to change the class of something, we could say .class. So we could actually change the class of this paragraph if we wanted to by saying something like class equals something. So this isn't something that I'm making up. These are the actual HTML properties that are defined as part of the HTML tag. We can set and change those, just like we can change the style of the page. So remember, JavaScript, HTML, and CSS all work together. The CSS defines the appearance of the page, the HTML, the content, and JavaScript allows us to dynamically change both the content of the page and the appearance of the page by manipulating the HTML or CSS. And we noticed in this case, sort of the workhorse of this solution is a get element by ID. And that's going to be used an awful lot, because what that does is that finds a thing on the page that has a particular ID. Because that's what when we find that, that's what we want to change. And then we change either the style or some aspect of the HTML. All right. Any questions about this? Okay, let's go on to an example that we're going to go over for a couple of weeks. Actually, let me try to find another example on the web. Use JavaScript to change an image. See, they have a function called change image. What it does is it finds the thing on the page that has that ID, And then we set the SRC property of it to be either the new or the water bottle or the color bottle. So as we click that, it goes back and forth. This is pretty similar to what we have done in our examples. The only difference is we're storing the element in a variable that we're calling, in this case, image. That just makes it easier to type this. Instead of, we could have just done this. We could have said document get element by ID my image. This just saves us a little bit of typing. We're going to take that element that we find using the ID and we store it in a variable called image, and then we can use it later on. So we're going to use that in our new example that I'm going to show you in a minute here. So keep in mind, we can change anything about the existing HTML or CSS of the page through JavaScript. So you want to change the font? You can do that. How do you do that? Well, what controls the font of a page? CSS does. What's the name of the attribute that changes it? Font family. Now, the one small difference is if there's a dash in the name of a property, we don't include the dash. We simply make it uppercase. So, for example, let's say I want to change the background color of the button. I could say, I want to change the style. I want to change the background color. Normally in CSS, we would say background dash color. But here in JavaScript, we say background color with no dash and the second word uppercase. So we can toggle between making it, let's make it green or blue, or green or red. So we'll make it green, make it red when we want to hide it. We'll make it green when we want to show it. It is red just to hide it. It becomes green to show it. Now you notice when the page initially loads that it has no color because we didn't use CSS to define it. We probably should go in our CSS and define a color for it so that when the page initially loads, it is green to show it. That's pretty straightforward to do. All right. So what we've seen is examples how to change the CSS and the HTML of an existing page. All right. Any of the elements of the page we can find, we can point to, and we can change some of the properties, whether they be CSS properties or HTML properties. We use the get element by ID and the use of the ID to find the specific element that we want to change. Therefore, a lot of our elements are now going to have IDs so that we can find them and change them. All right. Here's another example that we're going to go over, and we'll probably go over this for at least a couple weeks. The remainder of class today and probably class next week and possibly even a bit the following week. And this is sort of a bigger example. But this example involves us actually creating new HTML. In the examples that we saw before, we didn't create any new HTML. We simply changed either the style or something, some property of the HTML of something that was already created. In this example, we're actually going to create some HTML. All right. So what we have is this. We have this page. If I open it up, this allows us to enter in a foreground color and a background color, and it will change the paragraph to have those attributes. So if I say background color is blue, foreground color is white, it'll change the color. It also keeps a history in an unordered list of what we've changed the colors to. So if I change it to red and white, to make that change, and it's going to add to the history list that we changed it from blue and white to red and white. So every time we click on the button, it actually makes a change and it adds some HTML to that unordered list. All right. Now, this is a big example. We're going to examine bits of it at a time. So I'm going to point some things out in there, and I'm going to say, don't worry about this right now. So we're going to try to focus on little pieces of it. And that's key in trying to understand any sort of program, and a key to writing any program as well, is don't try to do everything all at once. All right. If you have to do 10 things in your program, focus on doing the first thing. When you have that first thing done, focus on doing the second thing and the third thing, and so on. Take it a bit at a time. Believe me, it'll save you a lot of trouble that way, and it's much less confusing to do. It's good for your attitude too, because then if you get, say, 3 things done today, you haven't completed the whole project, but at least you have 3 parts of the project that are working. If you attempt to do all 10 things of the project, you're liable to get none of them working correctly, and you're stuck with a project where nothing is working. All right. That is harder on your attitude than if you have a program that they only got 3 of the pieces working, but they're working at least. All right. So let's look at the code for this. Let's start off looking by the HTML. I don't think there's any CSS in this one. Focus of this one is adding and changing HTML. All right, we have a form that has a text box called TextBG and an ID of TextBG. A span called error text. We're going to put errors if there's a problem. There's nothing in there to begin with. We have a text box for the foreground color. We have a label for both of these, which is essential for accessibility reasons. Finally, we have buttons that will change the color, and then we have a button to clear the history. We then have a paragraph with an ID of changeable. That's the paragraph that we're actually going to change. And we have a UL, an unordered list setup with no list items. Right? And each time we click on that button, we're going to add a list item to it. Now, you might notice something about this. All right. That is that there is no on-click attribute for these inputs. So how does the browser know to execute any JavaScript? Well, we'll look at that in a couple minutes. That'll be one of the first things that we look at. I do want to show you what happens when you do click the button. It grabs the value of the background text box. It grabs the value of the foreground text box. It finds the thing on the page that has an ID of changeable and sets the background color to that. It finds the thing on the page with an ID of changeable and sets the color of that to foreground. So we're going to not worry about this right now. We're not going to worry about this right now. And we haven't seen how this change color function gets called yet, but we will in a minute. All right. Just know when the change color button is pressed, these are the instructions that we get executed. And we've seen those instructions before. We've seen very similar to those instructions. The only difference between, in this case, is we're grabbing the value that's in the text box. All right, there's a text box called BG. We're grabbing the value of it. There's a text box called FG. We're grabbing the value of it. It might be a good idea for you to load this example because it is available online, and so that you can scroll through it and look at it as I am discussing it. Okay, so the first thing we're going to examine is how this JavaScript even knows how to execute, because there's no onClick method. In previous examples, we said onClick equals, and then we've had something. Well, that's an okay way to do it by having the onClick attribute. There is, however, a better way. And let me explain to you why that it's a better way. It's a better way because it's best to have the JavaScript as separate as possible from the HTML. If you put an onClick event in the HTML, then your JavaScript and your HTML are sort of tied together. What's wrong with that? Well, that makes it harder to change one without changing the other, right? It's much better if these things are completely independent of each other, just like we've done with CSS and HTML. We've made those independent of each other, all right? And therefore, we can change one without messing up the other. So how do we assign that JavaScript to run when we click the button? We do it this way. First thing we do is we have this instruction here. And what this instruction does is it's adding an event to the page. It's adding an event to the window. And what this event says is when the page is finished loading, whoops, didn't mean that. When the page is finished loading, call this function. All right. It's adding an event. Now, these are the same events that we saw before. The only difference is when we put them intermixed with our HTML, we put onLoad or onClick. Here we just put the name of the action, load or click. What this instruction tells the browser to do, and it might be useful for you to comment the code, is this is saying when the page finishes loading, call the function named page loaded. And what that function does is this function assigns JavaScript to the HTML element. Why are we doing it this way? Again, because we want a clean separation between the HTML and the CSS on our page. HTML, CSS, HTML, and JavaScript on our page. If we do this well, we can actually put our JavaScript into a separate file, just like we've done with the CSS, and use that JavaScript on many different pages. Why do we have to do this? Why do we have to wait until the page finishes loading? Because before the page loads, an instruction like this might fail. Because if this instruction gets executed before the page finishes loading, guess what? It can't find the thing called button change, and therefore it will give you an error. So what we're going to do is we're going to be absolutely sure that this page is loaded before we go on and try to execute any JavaScript. So we wait until the page is loaded. We wait for that event to happen. So we add an event listener. A listener is code that is waiting for that event to happen. The event we're waiting for happen is load. The function that we're going to call is page loaded. So now the browser is going to be listening for the page to finish loading, and then it's going to call page load. I have this instruction here called console log, and I'm going to explain that in a minute. We're not going to worry about that right now. Here I'm finding the button on the page to change the color. And I'm doing that by saying document get element by ID button change. All that does is it puts in a variable called change button a pointer to the thing on the page that has an ID of button change, which is this button here. Now, do I have to do that? No. But this simplifies things because on this line, all I have to say is change button dot add event listener. I could have written this by saying this full statement but that line gets to be rather long. So I'm going to store the element of the HTML page in a variable, and I'm going to use that variable to set the listener. We're adding another event listener. What's an event listener? It is JavaScript code that's going to happen when a certain event happens on the particular HTML element. So the HTML element we're coding this for is the change button. The listener is listening for the event click. So it's waiting for that button to be clicked, and then it's going to call the function change color. All right. So let's put some comments in here. This function assigns JavaScript to the button. This says store the click button or the change button in the variable change button. This function assigns the function change color to the click event in other words, on click the way we did it before. Of the change button. So in other words, this instruction here, these two instructions here, is the equivalent if we did this. On click equals, and then we put in the name of the function. But notice that that has to be part of the HTML. Whereas our example up here is part of the JavaScript. So we achieve our goal of keeping things separate. Everything in its right place. JavaScript goes with JavaScript. HTML has just HTML. It has no CSS inside of it and has no JavaScript inside of it. And then that change color gets called when we click the button, and that finds the things, changes the color to them, and then creates an element in our list item. Now, one thing I've done is I've put in a console log that says here. This is very useful for debugging. Let me show you what I mean. When this page loads, when this page finished loading, we call this method page loaded. And I'm logging the word here to the console log. What does that mean? It means that if I view the log, I'll see that message. So if I go and view the console, that page loaded, all right, because everything loaded on the page. If I view at the console now, under more tools, developer tools in Chrome, other browsers have it in different places. I notice in the console the word here. In other words, this is telling me that this line was hit in the program. Why is that important? Well, let's say I make a mistake and I say page load instead of page loaded. And I wonder why my code isn't working. Notice that in addition to getting the error that tells me page load is not defined, I did not get the console log that says here. Therefore, I know that that page wasn't called. So I can put these things in to any of my functions and display messages and display values of variables and so on that tell me where I'm at inside the program, what JavaScript has run and maybe what JavaScript has not run. A lot of times we may have code that doesn't work. And there's sometimes a couple possibilities why it doesn't work. One possibility might be that your code is wrong. All right, always a chance of that. Another possibility is you think your code is being called, but it's not. In which case, you can spend time staring at a function and wondering why it's not working, when the problem isn't in the function. The problem is that function was never called at all. All right, so by putting messages in the console, we can see actually at what point has the code executed and what hasn't executed. Now, it's generally a good idea to comment out those when you're done. So I typically wouldn't have any console logs in something that I actually published or released to the web. I would keep them in, though, as a debugging tool if I had to check things later. All right, questions about this? Now, there's a feature I didn't show you in this case, and that is there's some validation done. So for example, if I don't type anything in, if I don't get anything in, it tells me I must enter something, and the two values must be different. So if I type in red and red, I can't change the color to that because then I wouldn't be able to see the red text on the red background. So it tells me the two values must be different. And likewise, I have to give a value for each of the entries, or it will give me an error. In other words, some validation is being performed. Let's take a look at how that validation works. Okay, so let's retrace our steps. This page loads. So the browser is displaying this page. Therefore, this event fires off. Page loaded. This sets the button change event to change color for the change button and clear history for the clear history button. So the user clicks the button and change color gets executed. Notice what the first thing in change color says. Validate form. Right? That is a JavaScript function. How do I know it's a function? Because it has these two parentheses after it. When you call a function, you have to supply arguments. We supply an argument here. We supply an argument here, here. In all these cases, we supply an argument. And in the case of validate form, there are no arguments, but we still have to put in the empty parentheses. If we did not have those parentheses, JavaScript would think validate form is a variable and wouldn't run because there's no value to it. In fact, just for laughs, let's get rid of these parentheses. All right. I type something in. Click to change color. It worked. Interesting. I put nothing in here. It was supposed to catch that error. So validation doesn't seem to be working. So how am I going to debug this? Well, I might stare at this validation function. But the first thing I want to do is I want to verify that that validation function is even getting called. So I'm going to type in console log validation called. Notice it doesn't appear in the console. Therefore, this is going to save me a lot of time because then instead of looking at what's wrong with this function never gets called. Therefore, I know not to spend my time looking and seeing if the validation function is called, but looking for reasons that the validation function did not get called. So I could put something in here. Right, change color got called, but validation didn't. So I know that there's a problem in change color that's keeping it from being called, keeping the validation from being called. And if I look at that and I look more closely, I would see that the problem is that I say validate form, but I don't put the parentheses after it. And therefore it assumes that validate form is a variable and not a function. So it never calls the function. Now, this is one thing about JavaScript that you might think is a blessing at first, but it can cause problems, as we've seen here. And that is, if variables are not defined, it doesn't always give you an error. All right. In this case, we never said anywhere what validate form was. Guess what? JavaScript doesn't care. It's going to try and do that. And it's going to look for a value named validate form. If it can't find it, results are going to be unpredictable. All right. So let's look at this validate form function. This validate form function is going to return either a true or a false. That is called a Boolean. A Boolean is a variable that can have two values, true or false. So this is the first case of a function that we've seen that actually returns a value. We call this function here, and this if statement is looking for either a true or false value. If this returns true, then we go on and execute these statements. If this returns false, then we do not execute these statements. So what within the parentheses in JavaScript gets evaluated in an if statement to determine whether that statement is true or false. So this is checking whether validate form returns true or returns false. And that's the two possibilities that this function can return, because it's going to return something at the very end, either true or false. We're going to assume the form is valid until we find a problem. Why do we do that? Well, you can trust me on that, or you can try to write it the opposite way, where you assume that the form is not valid and write if statements to prove that it is. It's easier to show that a form is not valid than to show if it's valid, because to show that a form is valid, you have to specify all the conditions that have to be true for the form to be valid. To show that a form is invalid, all you have to do is find one instance where the form is not correct, and then you know the form is invalid. So what do we do here? We're going to assume the form is valid. This is clearing out any previous error messages. You'll see later on in this function that if there's a problem, we actually put some HTML in these two spans. So if we run this once, there might be an error message in there. If we run it again and our values are correct, then we want to clear out those error messages before we start the validation again. So these two lines clear out any previous error messages. This is looking to see if the background color text box has no value. So we say if document get element by ID txtbg dot value. What does that mean? We're asking the value of the thing on the page that has an ID of txtbg, which is this text box. And if that value is equal to nothing, an empty string, two quotes next to each other, then what we do is we put an error in there that says, hey, you must enter something in there. And we now know that the form is not valid, so we set be valid to false. The way JavaScript if statements work are similar to other languages. This condition is either true or false. If it is true, we execute these statements between the two braces. If not, we either perform the else or we don't do anything. Now we'll look at next time, equals an empty string is not necessarily the best way to do it because we could put spaces in there and the value would not be empty string, and yet we have not entered anything into that field. But we'll go with this for right now. Two equal signs are used because we're doing a comparison. In JavaScript, like C#, if you've done that before, a double equal sign means we're comparing something to something else. And that comparison is either going to be true or false. So either the value is equal to nothing or the value is not equal to nothing. If it's equal to nothing, we do these statements. This is the exact same thing, except for the foreground text, which actually we don't need because this takes care of it. This does a comparison between the two to make sure that they're not equal. Because remember, we don't want the foreground and the background to be the same color. Otherwise, we won't be able to read the text. And when we're done, we return be valid. So, change color calls this validate form method. This validate form method executes and either returns be valid as true or be valid as false. If it's true, then we can go ahead and execute these statements because the form is valid. If this is false, then the form is not valid and we cannot execute the rest of those statements. All right, next time we're going to look at a better way to write this statement. And also, what's this business about creating HTML that we're doing here? All right, we'll look at those two different things. Your next assignment is actually a 2-week assignment. Please take the time to review it and start looking at the pieces that you think you can do right now. Believe it or not, with what I've gone over in class today, you should be able to do the first part where you calculate the fact that 6 nickels equals 30 cents or 2 dimes equals 20 cents and so on. We'll go over that more and we'll talk about that more next time, along with talking about how to create HTML on our page. All right, that's all I had for today. Do remember that I am in lab immediately following this class, and I will be in my WebEx room waiting for any questions. All right, we'll talk to you next time.